When I was a kid, maybe 9 or 10 years old, I remember playing football with my friends in the yard. We were all dressed up in our football jerseys and helmets and really focused on our future NFL combine. And of course, I was dressed as an LA Ram, Vince Ferragamo, if I recall. Anyway, I remember going out for a pass, and after making an incredible one-handed diving catch, I looked up to see a red pickup driving down the road and eventually slam into the back of a parked car. As we sat and watched the driver get out of the red pickup, we heard him tell the owner that a dog had run out in front of him, which forced him to swerve and hit the car. Well, all of us just looked at each other because we knew this wasn't true. There was no dog, no glaring sun, and no excuse. Yet this man would not own up to what he did, and he's supposed to be an adult. That threw me for a little loop, because if kids are supposed to admit when we screw up, why don't adults have to do the same? Well, perhaps this incident helped send me down the road to examining the psychology of human behavior and why we act like we do and how that affects our children. Admitting our mistakes, owning our screw-ups, saying we're sorry. Why has this simple part of life become so difficult to execute? Why are we so consumed with being right that it hinders our growth and damages our trust and taints our character? It's an interesting study with many layers that work together to help explain the rationale behind one of the most irrational things that we do. To fully understand my take on the subject, I need to explain a few components to this discussion. The first thing to understand is the heartbeat of why we can't admit fault. Well, when you dissect the core of this problem, we find ourselves staring directly at our own egos. The ego. It's the shield that protects us from the harshities of the world and its imperfections. But the thing is, it's protective, it's controlling, and it's fragile. And when it takes direct fire, it forces us to face the notion that we are not infallible. And for some reason, when the ego becomes their identity for some, admitting mistakes is not even on the menu of possibilities, even against overwhelming evidence. Delicate egos and fragile self-esteem lack the mental resilience required for accountability. Their psychological framework is so frail that admitting fault is truly psychologically damaging, so much so that our defense mechanism, it does something strange to cope. They literally distort reality. The weak ego actually changes the facts in the mind so it is no longer wrong. Those guilty of this may think it's a sign of strength, but it's really the complete opposite. It's psychological weakness and borderline sociopathic. Yet, so many are guilty of this. Psychologists believe that those unwilling to face their mistakes suffer from a form of cognitive dissonance, where they only accept the information they want to hear and deny anything that contradicts their beliefs. Therefore, they're never wrong. To sum it up, the ego is not your amigo. As we pull back another layer to this psychological onion, we can't help but gravitate towards social media. Is it possible that we've crafted a fictional, perfect world through social media and online interactions where the constant portrayal of perfection starts to affect our perception of reality? I believe we have, and our impressionable children have adopted it as truth. As I've mentioned before, when we consistently repeat certain patterns, it begins to shape the picture of what we actually think is real. We have been conditioned to believe that perfection actually exists. We see it in movies, we hear it from our leaders, we even embody this in our social media and our online lives. We are perfect. There's no room for missteps or imperfections, and if they exist, we cover them up. We use filters. We hide what blemishes or errors that might paint us in a negative light, therefore making it nearly impossible to confront our own shortcomings. Shattering that glass ceiling of perfection with our mistakes proves to be too detrimental to our delicate egos. Now, weaving these two ideas together is another thread, and it's our genetic makeup. It's the third layer. We are a negative society. It's the way we're wired. We are genetically predisposed to pick out what's wrong with something rather than what's right. We are more likely to complain than compliment. Do you remember the cartoon when you were a kid where someone was struggling with their own conscience, and on this shoulder sat an angel telling them how great the world was and how you should act and everything's going to be fine? But over on this shoulder sat the devil, and he's telling him all that's wrong with the world and you should act out. Well, whose voice do you think is louder in our heads? Who do we tend to listen to? Not sure? Well, just look around the stands at your ball games, where fans are intently focused on everything that goes wrong and not so much on what goes right. Think about what is screamed at our officials. Is it a compliment? Hey, Mr. Official, I just wanted to say, great job on that last call. No, they criticize to the point of personal attacks. And the more this conduct continues, the more it serves to strengthen the belief that errors are unwelcome and will inevitably invite a barrage of personal criticism. And who wants to be yelled at for every mistake they make so we don't admit them? And to further the point of the negative mindset, athletes, I want you to think of a game you played recently, a game where by everyone's standards, you played well. However, you can't enjoy it because all you can think about are the one or two mistakes you made. You know what I mean? It's the negative mindset. We live in a world that judges harshly, judges quickly, without facts, without compassion, and without the ability to look in the mirror before passing judgment on others. We also live in a world with a lot of victims. The victim mentality has almost become trendy, where it allows us to give away responsibility and never hold ourselves accountable. It's always the fault of another. I'm only this way because of them, or I didn't have a chance, no opportunity, no time. Well, you know what? I'm tired of hearing it. Sure, there are always circumstances in life that might give an advantage to others, but to keep yourself down and not let yourself be responsible for your own behaviors, your own mistakes, and to believe that life's fruits are not plucked by you, but given to you by someone else, only helps sell the idea that you are not in control and thus not responsible for your actions. The lack of accountability for making wrong choices, it's become popular practice. We've seen politicians cling ferociously to their own mistruths without anything resembling a conscience, while the media perpetuates the lie to the point that the truth starts to be altered, and then we don't even know what's happening. And we've even seen it in our own companies, where they invest in something that doesn't deliver, come through on their promises, but instead of rectifying the situation and abandon something that isn't working, the company starts to operate on pride and begins to control the information, double down on their bad decision, and blinded by their own ego, they end up destroying trust and their reputation, all because of a stubborn adherence to failing policies. They couldn't admit they were wrong. They don't value truth, they value power. Ego is about who's right. The truth is about what's right. And as I think more about this topic, I can't help but see a value system replaced by faulty principles and erroneous logic. And that's why I find it funny how we've become a society who can't own their own bad decisions, but are dedicated to fixing the mistakes of others and the past. We destroy history. We cancel what isn't politically correct. We erase what doesn't suit a culture who is so sorely misguided, so much that they can't see that erasing the mistakes of the past are only going to guarantee their return in the future. But for me, it always comes back to the lessons we instill in our children. Because if we don't do something, this affliction of avoiding responsibility for our mistakes manifests in our kids and is supported by their out-of-touch parents. Coaches and teachers end up tiptoeing around kids who are uncoachable, unteachable, unable to be disciplined. And these kids are told by their parents that they are perfect and can do no wrong, like they've raised a Division I athlete or the next Rhodes Scholar. It's almost an impossible scenario for our coaches and educators to handle. And it's one of the main reasons people abandon the teaching and coaching profession, because we raised a bunch of egomaniacs who are never wrong and are never at fault. So despite the resistance toward admitting we're wrong and saying we're sorry, we have to find a way to somewhat normalize wrongness so our own ego and fallibility doesn't cripple and prevent us from teaching our children that they don't always have to be right. Look, it's natural to get a little defensive or provide excuses for why you were wrong, but deflecting responsibility for our errors stands in the way of growth. And our kids need to see that. We need to see that. To admit without excuse, to acknowledge without pointing fingers, and to own up to our blunders, to just stand there and say, I was wrong, does so much for our character and helps us get out of our own way when it means becoming a better person. And according to psychologists, kids who learn from their parents that it's okay and comfortable to admit when you're wrong, well, they grow up more open and honest. But that behavior has to be modeled. And right now, we need to do a better job. The only thing more dangerous than not learning from your mistakes is not being able to recognize them. I know society has trained us to feel ashamed of our gaffes and that if we are perfect, then we can be happy. And it's that fear of not being perfect or screwing something up which stifles us as we get older. Take a child, for example. There's so much that we can learn from the innocence of our children. When children play, when they learn, they have a fearless attitude where their ability to try supersedes their fear of failing. And our kids, they never learn to care about failure until we teach them to be ashamed of getting it wrong. However, as grown-ups, if we can't figure out how to rein in our own egos and humbly set aside our own pride, there's no way we can possibly serve as the role models our children deserve. Admitting when we are wrong, facing our own bad decisions, and owning up to them does not make you any less of a person. It shows courage, honesty, and strength of character. Our students, our athletes, our kids, they deserve the best versions of those who lay the foundation that fosters their growth, and that is us. And it's through these candid admissions that we realize that the only real mistake is the one from which we learn nothing. Embracing the humility to acknowledge when we falter enables us to learn, to evolve. Making mistakes is part of life. Owning those mistakes is part of being human. And the most important job we have is teaching our kids to not just celebrate the success, but celebrate the attempts. And to teach our kids that life and people and filters are not perfect. And being real, even if you're wrong, is more important than being flawless. Embrace the beauty of imperfection because that's the raw material of greatness. We need to teach that admitting mistakes doesn't make you weak. It just means you value your relationships more than your ego. And let's teach our kids that mistakes are acceptable, but fear of those mistakes is not. One of the greatest mistakes you can make in life is to be continually fearing that you will make one. Let's let our kids know that mistakes are the growing pains of wisdom. And lastly, finally, for our kids and for everyone else to remember, the moment you accept responsibility for everything in your life is the moment you gain the power to change anything in your life. And those are Scott's thoughts.